Everyone thinks they already know Eric Cartman. The fat kid, the racist jokes, the schemes that always blow up in his face, the comic relief who never actually changes. That is the version most people carry around in their heads. But a professor who studies psychopathy once used Cartman as a teaching example for something far more specific than comic relief. What that comparison actually reveals is where this video starts. This is the entire story of Eric Cartman, where Cartman came from. Long before Eric Cartman became one of the most recognized cartoon characters in the world, he started as a rough drawing on construction paper, made by two college students with a camera, some scissors, and almost no money. The story of Cartman begins not in South Park, Colorado, but at the University of Colorado Boulder, where two film students named Trey Parker and Matt Stone were working on class projects together in the early 1990s. Neither of them had any way of knowing that a joke short they made for fun would eventually turn into one of the longest running shows in television history, or that one character from that short would become a household name. Parker and Stone were both film students with a shared sense of humor that leaned crude, fast, and a little bit mean. They liked stop-motion animation, the kind where you move paper cutouts a tiny bit at a time and take a picture after each movement. It is a slow, patient process, and back then it was also a cheap one. All you needed was paper, scissors, glue, and a lot of time. In 1992, the two of them put that method to use and created a short film called Jesus vs. Frosty. The title says almost everything you need to know about the humor. It showed Jesus Christ getting into a fight with Frosty the Snowman, done in a style that looked like something a talented kid might make with construction paper on a kitchen table. It was crude, it was strange, and it was funny to the small group of people who saw it. At this point, there was no character named Cartman yet, at least not officially. There was a chubby boy in the short, one of several kids drawn in that same rough paper style, and this boy would later be recognized as the earliest version of Cartman. He did not look exactly like the Cartman audiences would come to know. His personality was not fully formed either. He was really just an early sketch of an idea, a placeholder character sitting in a joke video that Parker and Stone had made mostly to entertain themselves and their friends. 3 years later, in 1995, an opportunity came along that would end up changing everything. A television executive who had seen Jesus vs. Frosty circulating quietly among people in Hollywood asked Parker and Stone to make something similar as an animated video Christmas card. The result was a second short called Jesus vs. Santa, sometimes also known by the title The Spirit of Christmas. It used the same construction paper cutout style as the first short, but it went further and sharper with the jokes, and it included a boy who was much closer to the Cartman that audiences know today. Something interesting happened during the making of these two shorts that fans of the show have talked about for years. The characters and their names were still being worked out between the first short and the second one. The boy who would grow up to be Cartman did not have a settled name yet in 1992. By the time the second short came around in 1995, the name Cartman had been given to him, while a separate boy character, the one who would later be known and loved as Kenny, ended up carrying a name that had briefly belonged to the earlier version of Cartman. In other words, the identities of these two boys were still shifting and settling into place, even as Parker and Stone were building the small town of South Park in their minds. It took two short films and a good deal of trial and error before the character we now call Cartman was locked into place with his name, his shape, and the beginnings of his personality. The name Cartman itself has a real story behind it, and it did not come from a writer's room or a brainstorming session. It came from a Super Bowl party. On January 29th, 1995, Trey Parker was at a party with friends, watching the game the way millions of other people were that day. Among the people at that party was a real person named Matt Cartman, a friend of both Parker and Stone. Cartman was known among his friends for being a little overweight, not very tall, loud, and extremely quick with comebacks whenever anyone tried to tease him. During the party, while everyone was talking and joking around watching football, one of the people in the room told Cartman to be quiet, using his last name to do it. Trey Parker was sitting nearby, quietly taking it all in. The first short film, Jesus vs. Frosty, had already been finished back in 1992, and the chubby boy character in it still needed a proper name. Watching his friend get ribbed at that Super Bowl party gave Parker the name he had been missing. The character became Cartman, named after a real person the creators knew personally, someone whose personality traits, the stubbornness, the mouth, the refusal to back down, would end up living on inside a cartoon fourth grader for decades to come. Cartman was not built out of nothing though. Parker and Stone have said in interviews over the years that the character draws a good amount of inspiration from Archie Bunker, the lead character of the classic American sitcom All in the Family. Archie Bunker was a working class man in that show, known for saying things that were bigoted, narrow-minded, and often deeply offensive, all while the show around him tried to expose how how wrong his thinking was. Archie Bunker himself had been inspired by an earlier British character named Alf Garnett from a show called Till Death Us Do Part, which used a similar loudmouth, prejudiced father figure to poke at British society in the 1960s. So Cartman sits at the end of a long chain of characters designed to say the ugly things a society is thinking quietly out loud, for the exact purpose of holding those thoughts up to the light. Parker and Stone have explained that they loved the idea of putting a character like Archie Bunker onto television again, but by the 1990s, they believed it would be almost impossible to get away with an adult man saying those kinds of things on a modern show. Audiences and networks were far more sensitive to that kind of material coming from a grown man playing it straight in a regular sitcom setting. So the two of them came up with a workaround. What if the bigoted, selfish, endlessly stubborn Archie Bunker type character was not a grown man at all, but a cartoon child, drawn simply, living in a small mountain town most people had never heard of? A 9-year-old boy saying outrageous things read differently to an audience than a grown man saying the exact same lines. The cartoon format gave them a kind of shield. It let them push the character's opinions and behavior to extremes that might have felt too heavy or too real coming from a live-action adult. That decision, wrapping a difficult personality inside the body of a cartoon child in a fictional town called South Park, Colorado, is the exact moment Cartman, as audiences know him, was born. The physical look of Cartman also comes from those very early roots in construction paper animation. In the original two shorts, everything was made using cutout paper shapes, moved slightly frame by frame to fake motion, the same basic technique people use to make homemade flipbooks or shadow puppets, just done with a camera instead. When South Park moved from being a private joke short into an actual television show, the visual style stayed close to that same rough, cutout look on purpose. Cartman, like the rest of the cast, is built from simple geometric shapes and bright, solid primary colors. He does not have the smooth range of motion you would expect from hand-drawn cartoons like the ones made at big animation studios. Instead, his movements are somewhat stiff and jerky, and for a long time, he was mostly shown from one angle, almost like a puppet being slid across a table, rather than a character walking freely through a scene. This was not a mistake or a limitation the creators were stuck with. It was a style they leaned into fully, because it made the show look handmade and a little bit dangerous, like something that should not exist on network television, but somehow did anyway. Interestingly, this look did not stay purely handmade for very long behind the scenes, even though it kept looking that way on screen. Starting with the show's second episode, called Weight Gain 4000, which aired during the very first season back in 1997, Cartman and every other character on South Park began to be animated using computer software instead of actual paper cutouts. This was a practical decision. Making an entire weekly television show by physically cutting and moving paper by hand, one frame at a time, would have been almost impossible to keep up with on a tight schedule. Computers let the animators move much faster while still copying that same flat, jagged cutout look the audience had already come to expect. The show wanted people to believe they were still watching something crude and handmade, even though behind the curtain, technology had already taken over the actual production. This trick worked so well that many longtime fans still assume, incorrectly, that South Park is animated entirely by hand even today. It was also in that same early episode, Weight Gain 4000, that one of Cartman's most basic physical facts was locked into the show's official record. His weight, 90 pounds, was stated directly in that episode, giving fans and future writers a specific number to point back to whenever his size became part of a joke or a storyline. Even this small detail says something about how South Park operated from the very beginning. Nothing about Cartman was left vague by accident. Everything, from his weight to his clothing to his voice, was decided on early and then treated with a surprising amount of consistency for a show that often looked like pure chaos on the surface. Cartman's outfit has stayed almost completely unchanged since those earliest episodes. He wears a red winter coat, brown pants, and yellow gloves, topped off with a light blue knit cap that has a yellow brim and a yellow puffball on top. This combination of colors and shapes makes him instantly recognizable even in silhouette, which matters a great deal for a character built out of simple geometric pieces rather than detailed line work. A show relying on flat colors and basic shapes needs its characters to be readable at a glance, and Cartman's design does exactly that. Even someone who has never watched a single episode of South Park can usually pick Cartman out of a lineup of cartoon characters just from his hat and coat alone. The voice audiences hear when Cartman speaks also has an origin story that goes back to Trey Parker's time in film school, well before South Park existed in any form. Parker has explained that while he and Stone were still still students, they used to speak to each other in exaggerated, high-pitched, childish voices, mostly to annoy their film teachers and make each other laugh during class. That habit followed them into the earliest South Park shorts, where those same high-pitched voices got used for the young characters on screen. Over time, the exact method changed. Instead of straining his voice into an unnatural high pitch during recording, which would be hard to sustain over years of production, Parker began speaking in his normal vocal range, but with a clear, childlike tone and rhythm to it. That recording then gets adjusted afterward using audio editing software, which raises the pitch just enough to make the voice sound like it belongs to a 10-year-old boy. Parker has described using a similar process for Stan's voice, but adding extra weight and fullness to the sound specifically for Cartman, giving him a slightly heavier, more self-satisfied tone that fits his personality. All of this groundwork, the shorts, the naming, the design, the voice, came together and led to one specific date, August 13th, 1997. That was the day South Park officially premiered on Comedy Central with its very first broadcast episode, titled Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. This was the moment Cartman stopped being a character known only to a small circle of industry insiders, passing around bootleg copies of a homemade Christmas video, and became a character the general public could tune in and watch for themselves. The plot of that first episode centers on Cartman claiming that he was abducted by aliens, who performed strange experiments on him, something none of the adults in town initially believe. As the episode unfolds, his story turns out to have more truth to it than anyone expected. It set the tone early for a show that would spend the next several decades mixing outrageous, often disturbing plots with a strange kind of emotional honesty buried underneath the jokes. Adult animation was still a fairly rare thing on American television in 1997. The Simpsons had already proven that a cartoon could carry sharp social commentary and hold a massive audience, and shows like Beavis and Butthead had shown that crude, low-budget animated humor aimed at older viewers could also succeed. But South Park pushed further into territory that felt genuinely risky for the time, especially for a cable channel that was still building its reputation. Comedy Central was a smaller, younger network compared to the major broadcast channels, and taking a chance on a show this rough-looking and this willing to offend was a real gamble. That gamble paid off quickly. The show became an immediate hit, and Cartman, more than any other character in the cast, became the face people pointed to when they talked about what made South Park different from anything else on television at the time. There is a small but well-known piece of behind-the-scenes trivia connected to the show's earliest unaired pilot version that is worth mentioning here, since it shows just how much was still being figured out even after the show got picked up. In an early cut of the pilot episode that was never actually broadcast, Cartman was shown having a father and a sister at home, neither of whom ever appeared again in any episode that made it to air. Whatever plans Parker and Stone may have had for expanding Cartman's family early on, they abandoned that idea almost immediately once the show moved forward. Cartman would go on to be defined for the rest of the series by having only one parent shown regularly, his mother, and by the complete absence of a father figure in his daily life. That absence would eventually turn into one of the longest running mysteries in the entire show, something that would not get resolved until many years and hundreds of episodes later. It is worth remembering that hint of a father and sister flickering briefly in an unaired pilot only to vanish completely, because it shows that even from the very beginning, the question of where Cartman really came from, both as a character built by two students and as a boy without a father inside his own fictional world, was already sitting quietly underneath the show's earliest moments. Another small but telling detail from the production history involves the earliest test material made before the show settled into its final form. Some of that very early behind-the-scenes footage suggests that the character who was eventually killed and mourned using the show's famous catchphrase about Kinney being killed may have actually started out as an early version of Cartman himself, before the names and roles got sorted out between the two characters. This lines up with what is known about the shifting names and designs between the 1992 and 1995 shorts. It is a small piece of trivia, but it is a good reminder that South Park's cast, including Cartman, did not arrive fully formed. They were built gradually, swapped, adjusted, and renamed before locking into the versions of themselves that would go on to appear in hundreds of episodes. Once the show was up and running, Cartman's popularity did not take long to show itself in a measurable way. Just 2 years after his television debut, in 1999, a poll conducted by the bank NatWest in the United Kingdom asked children between the ages of 8 and 9 who their favorite personality was. Cartman came out on top of that poll. Adults at the time, including some parent groups, were reportedly uneasy about the idea that a character character known for saying such harsh, offensive, and openly prejudiced things had become a favorite among real children that young. Matt Stone responded to the concern at the time by saying the results were upsetting mainly to people who held an overly perfect, unrealistic picture of what children were actually like. That single poll result, coming so early in the show's run, gives a clear early signal of something that would remain true for the rest of Cartman's history. Audiences, including very young ones, were drawn to him in a way that made adults nervous, and that discomfort would end up becoming one of the most consistent threads running through his entire story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By the end of the show's first couple of years, all the basic pieces of Cartman were in place. The name, the look, the voice, the personality borrowed from an old sitcom archetype. What he did not have yet was the depth audiences would come to know once he settled into a regular 4th grade classroom beside Stan, Kyle, and Kenny. That part of the story was only just beginning. Section 2, the early years, 3rd grade and the original 4. When South Park premiered in August of 1997, Eric Cartman was introduced as one of 4 boys who rode the same school bus stop and sat in the same classroom in the fictional mountain town of South Park, Colorado. The other 3 boys were Stan Marsh, Kyle Broflovsky, and Kenny McCormick, and together the 4 of them formed the core group that almost every early episode of the show revolved around. For the first several years of the series, covering the first 58 episodes of the show, these 4 boys were shown as elementary school students, all placed in the same classroom under a teacher named Mr. Garrison. It was not until the 4th season, in an episode simply called 4th Grade, that the boys aged up on screen and moved into the next grade. For most of what people now think of as classic early South Park, Cartman and his friends were still elementary school students, and the show treated that setting as a fixed, steady backdrop for years. The very first episode, Cartman Gets an Unusual Encounter, set the tone for what these 4 boys would be like together. In that episode, the 4 boys are shown as ordinary, foul-mouthed little kids from a small town, waiting for the school bus like any other morning, when Kyle's baby brother Ike gets taken by aliens. Those same aliens are connected to strange incidents happening around town, including cows found mysteriously injured, and eventually it comes out that Cartman himself was abducted and had a probe placed inside him by the aliens as part of some kind of experiment. None of the adults in town believe his story at first. This episode is a useful starting point for understanding the group dynamic that would carry through the show for years. Stan and Kyle are shown as the 2 boys closest to being a normal pair of best friends, reacting to the weirdness around them with something closer to disbelief and normal kid logic. Kenny is present, but often hard to understand because of the way his hood covers most of his face and muffles his speech. Cartman stands apart from the other 3 from the very beginning, both because of the strange things that happen to him and because of how he reacts to them, usually with more self-interest and more willingness to lie than the other boys show. The second episode of the series, called Weight Gain 4000, matters a great deal to the story of Cartman specifically because it locks in one of his defining physical traits early and permanently. In this episode, Cartman enters an essay contest about environmental protection, and through cheating and manipulation manages to win, despite having submitted an essay that does not actually reflect any real understanding of the topic. As part of the episode's plot, his weight is directly stated as 90 pounds, giving the show and its writers a specific official number to point back to whenever a joke or storyline needed to reference exactly how much he weighed. This episode also marked the point where the show's animation shifted from being made using actual paper cutouts to being made with computer software. Even though the visual style was kept close to the same rough, geometric, primary colored look audiences had already gotten used to from the 2 earlier shorts. From this episode onward, Cartman's weight became a fixed and frequently mentioned detail about him, something other characters bring up constantly, sometimes as an insult, and something Cartman himself is often sensitive about even while denying that sensitivity outright. Only a few episodes later, in season 1, the show sent Cartman on one of its stranger early adventures, in an episode called Starvin' Marvin. In this story, the boys pool their money together hoping to buy a special sports watch that has been advertised on television, sending away for it through an offer connected to a charity supporting hungry children overseas. Instead of receiving the watch, the boys accidentally receive an actual Ethiopian child in the mail, a boy they end up naming Marvin. Once government authorities become involved and the mix-up is discovered, the situation resolves in a strange and pointed way specifically for Cartman. Rather than simply correcting the error, authorities mistake Cartman himself for a starving child in need of aid, and he is shipped off to Ethiopia in Marvin's place, ending up face to face with a real-world celebrity known at the time for her charity work in the region. Cartman. The joke depends entirely on Cartman's size being read by outsiders as something other than what it actually is, adding another layer to the running theme the show had already built around his weight just one episode earlier. Christmas that same year brought one of the most highly regarded episodes of the show's entire first season, Mr. Hanky the Christmas Pooh, which aired on December 17th, 1997. Most of the episode's plot centers on Kyle, who feels isolated as the only Jewish child in town during a holiday season built entirely around Christmas, and who begins seeing a talking, sentient piece of feces named Mr. Hanky that nobody else believes is real. Cartman's role in this episode, while smaller than Kyle's, still leaves a lasting mark on the show's history. At one point, Kyle, upset and frustrated, flings Mr. Hanky directly at Cartman, an act everyone else in the room misinterprets as Kyle simply throwing feces at his classmate for no reason, further fueling the belief that Kyle has lost his grip on reality. This episode is also notable for introducing a song called Kyle's Mom is a Big Fat Bitch, sung by Cartman, which would go on to become one of his most recognized musical numbers, later reused in the show's feature film years afterward. The episode closes with the town nearly tearing itself apart trying to build a Christmas pageant offensive to absolutely nobody, only for Mr. Hanky to reveal himself as real once everyone, including Chef, admits to believing in him. That same holiday season also produced Damien, an episode in which the son of Satan enrolls at South Park Elementary after being shunned by the other children for reasons connected to his family background. The story builds toward an enormous pay-per-view boxing match between Jesus Christ and Satan himself, staged as a genuine televised sporting event for the whole world to watch. Cartman, true to form, treats the entire situation less as a matter of cosmic importance and more as an opportunity, getting caught up in the spectacle and commercial excitement surrounding the fight, rather than showing any particular concern about what a battle between good and evil might actually mean. Episodes like this one demonstrate how comfortable the show already was within its first season, using enormous, absurd premises, a literal fight between heaven and hell, and filtering them entirely through the reactions of ordinary, distracted elementary school kids. Season 2 continued building on Cartman's household and his personal quirks with an episode called Spooky Fish, which introduced the idea of a parallel universe existing alongside the normal town of South Park. In this alternate universe, several of the show's characters exist as opposite versions of themselves, and Cartman's counterpart from this other dimension is shown as a genuinely evil version of the boy audiences already knew, identifiable specifically by a small goatee, a visual detail that became so recognizable it has been referenced and reused in later South Park material for years afterward, as a quick, easy way to signal an evil alternate version of a character. The joke works precisely because the differences between the ordinary Cartman and this darker double are, in some ways, disturbingly small, poking at the idea that Cartman's usual behavior was already sitting closer to real cruelty than most of the people around him seemed willing to admit. Cartman's home life received further attention that same season in an episode called Cat Orgy, the first part of a 3-episode storyline. In this story, Cartman's mother leaves him in the care of Stan's short-tempered older sister Shelley while she attends a party built around watching a meteor shower. Left largely unsupervised, the household quickly spirals into chaos once Shelley invites her much older boyfriend over, creating an uncomfortable and tense babysitting situation for the boys stuck there. Running alongside this main plot is a much stranger complication involving Cartman's own cat, which goes into heat during the episode and sets off a chaotic search for other cats around the neighborhood, giving the episode its title. Small domestic details like this, a cat wandering the household, a mother leaving her son with an unreliable babysitter, continued to reinforce the loose, low supervision environment Cartman was consistently shown growing up inside, even in stories that were not directly about his father or his upbringing at all. By season 3, the show had also begun exploring how Cartman interacted with religious and cultural traditions different from his own, particularly through Kyle's Jewish background. An episode called Jubilee sends Kyle, Kenny, and Kyle's younger brother Ike to a Jewish scout camp, where the biblical figure of Moses himself makes an appearance as part of the story. Cartman, unable to resist inserting himself into an event he was never invited to, works his way into the camp as well, driven less by genuine curiosity about Jewish tradition and more by his usual instinct to interfere with anything Kyle is involved in without him. This same general period of the show also produced Shinpokomon, an episode built around a parody of a wildly popular toy and media franchise sweeping through South Park Elementary. Cartman throws himself completely into the trend, obsessing over collecting the toys and desperate not to be left out of whatever his classmates are excited about, showing an early version of the same impulse that would drive him, decades later, toward chasing internet trends and cultural crazes well into the show's most recent seasons. Taken together, these early season 1, 2, and 3 episodes reveal a version of Cartman whose worst qualities were still developing in relatively contained, almost cartoonish ways, compared to what the show would eventually allow him to do. He lies about being abducted, he cheats in a school essay contest, he gets mistaken for a starving child due to his weight, he flings insults through the mouth of a sentient piece of feces, he chases toy fads, and he tries to force his way into religious ceremonies that have nothing to do with him. None of these acts carry the same weight as the schemes and betrayals that would come to define him just a few years later in the show's timeline. What they do instead is establish piece by piece a consistent personality already fully visible by the end of season 3. A boy who inserts himself everywhere, takes credit where none is due, treats other people's beliefs and traditions as background noise for his own convenience, and consistently finds himself at the center of whatever strange event the town happens to be dealing with that week. During these earliest seasons, Cartman lived with his mother, Leanne Cartman, in a home with no father present and no explanation given for where that father might be. This detail was treated almost casually at first, simply part of the household setup rather than something the show made a point of dwelling on right away. Cartman was also shown during this period to have a couple of pets at home, including a pot-bellied pig and a cat, both of which appeared in a handful of early episodes before quietly disappearing from the show without much explanation, the way background details on long-running series sometimes do. One of the more memorable uses of Cartman's pig came in an episode from the 3rd season, in which Kyle receives a baby elephant as a gift, and an effort follows to try to get that elephant to breed with Cartman's pig, a plotline that gives a good sense of just how strange and exaggerated the show's premises could get, even in stories that were technically about pets belonging to 4th grade boys. Kenny McCormick's role in these early seasons deserves particular attention, because one of the most famous running jokes in the entire history of the show comes directly from how Kenny was treated during this period. In episode after episode throughout the first several seasons, Kenny dies, usually in some sudden, violent, and often absurd way, only to reappear alive and unharmed in the very next episode with no explanation given for how he came back. Stan and Kyle react to almost every one of these deaths with a shocked cry, blaming whoever or whatever was responsible. This pattern became one of the most quoted and recognized features of the show during its early years, repeated so often that audiences began to expect and look forward to it. Cartman's reaction to Kenny's frequent deaths tended to be far more casual than Stan and Kyle's. Where the other two boys treated each death as a fresh tragedy, Cartman often responded with irritation, indifference, or a joke, treating Kenny's death as an inconvenience rather than something to be upset about. This small but consistent difference in reaction says a great deal about how the show was already positioning Cartman as the member of the group least likely to feel what the other boys felt, even in the earliest and simplest version of the character. The friendship between these 4 boys was never presented, even from the start, as a warm or uncomplicated one. Stan and Kyle are generally shown as being closer to each other than either of them is to Cartman, sharing more of a genuine, easy friendship built on shared jokes and shared frustration with the strange things constantly happening around them. Kenny, because of his family's poverty, which is referenced repeatedly in these early seasons, through jokes about his tattered orange coat and his family's financial struggles, often exists somewhat on the edges of the group's day-to-day conversations, though he remains fully part of the friend group in every episode. Cartman is the one boy the other 3 are shown getting annoyed with constantly, arguing with regularly, and at times openly wondering why they even continue spending time with him. Even so, the 4 of them are shown together again and again, riding the same bus, sitting in the same classroom, and getting pulled into the same bizarre town events. The show never fully explains why these 4 specific boys became friends in the first place, and it does not try to. Their friendship is simply presented as an established fact of the town, the same way the mountains around South Park or the bus stop bench are established facts of its geography. One of the clearest examples of Cartman's early personality on full display comes from the Halloween episode called Pink Eye, which aired during the first season. In that episode, Kenny is killed early on, and later returns from the dead as a zombie because of an accident at the local morgue, setting off a chain reaction that turns much of the town into zombies as well, something the townspeople mistake for a pink eye outbreak rather than recognizing it as an actual zombie problem. Cartman's own storyline within that same episode involves him getting into trouble at school for wearing a costume of Adolf Hitler, an early example of the show using Cartman to touch on genuinely disturbing historical material inside what was still technically a comedy about elementary school kids. Even in these very first episodes, before Cartman had committed any of the far more serious acts that would come to define his reputation in later seasons, the show was already willing to use him as the character through which it could reference things far darker and far more uncomfortable than what most cartoons, or even most cartoons made for adults, were willing to touch. Cartman's prejudices, particularly toward Kyle, who is Jewish, were also present from these very early seasons, though they were generally simpler and more overtly cartoonish in these years, compared to how calculated and manipulative his behavior would eventually become. In these early episodes, Cartman's insults toward Kyle come across mostly as a fourth grader's crude idea of an insult, the kind of thing a bully might say without necessarily understanding the full weight of what he is saying. Kyle, for his part, is shown pushing back against Cartman constantly during these years, frequently calling him fat and stupid in return, and the two of them argue and insult each other in nearly every episode where they share a scene. This back and forth between Cartman and Kyle, each one needling the other, became one of the show's most consistent and reliable sources of conflict and humor throughout the entire third grade era, long before the show introduced any of the deeper, more personal history that would later be revealed to connect the two families. Cartman's relationship with authority figures, particularly Mr. Garrison and the school counselor Mr. Mackey, was another defining piece of his character from these early seasons. Cartman was shown again and again trying to talk his way out of trouble, blaming other people for his own actions, and generally treating rules as things that applied to other people rather than to himself. Unlike Stan and Kyle, who occasionally got into trouble but usually showed some kind of concern about being punished, Cartman treated most consequences as minor annoyances to be argued away rather than lessons to be learned. This pattern of behavior, avoiding blame, manipulating adults, and refusing to accept responsibility, was present in a fairly mild form during these first few seasons. Nothing close to the scale of what Cartman would eventually be capable of in later years, but the basic shape of his personality, the refusal to admit faults, and the constant search for an angle was already fully visible to anyone watching those earliest episodes closely. It is worth noting that during this same period, the show was already beginning to plant the pieces of what would become one of its longest running storylines, the mystery surrounding Cartman's father. Season 1 ended with an episode that raised the question of who Cartman's father actually was without providing an answer, a mystery that the show would continue circling back to across the next several seasons. This early unresolved thread sat quietly in the background of the third grade years, mentioned occasionally but never fully addressed, giving the show a long-term storyline it could return to again and again over the better part of a decade. During these years, Cartman's mother, Leanne, was shown as endlessly patient and endlessly permissive toward her son, rarely enforcing any real discipline no matter what he did, a parenting style that the show repeatedly suggested was part of the reason Cartman behaved the way he did. She gave him almost anything he asked for and rarely punished him in any lasting way, a dynamic that stayed consistent across these early seasons and would continue to shape his character for the rest of the show's run. By the end of the third grade era, which closed out with the transition into fourth grade partway through the show's fourth season, the basic outlines of Cartman's personality inside his friend group were firmly set. He was established as the boy who lied more than the others, who took credit for things he did not do, who insulted Kyle constantly, who reacted to Kenny's deaths with a shrug rather than shock, and who somehow remained part of the same four-person friend group despite giving Stan, Kyle, and Kenny constant reasons to want nothing to do with him. None of the show's most extreme or most disturbing Cartman storylines had happened yet during these years. He had not yet crossed into the kind of behavior that would eventually be described by the show's own writers as making him one of the most evil characters ever put on television. What these early seasons did instead was lay down the groundwork, the friendships, the classroom, the running jokes, and the small unresolved mysteries, all of which the show would spend the rest of its run slowly building on top of. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One of those small unresolved mysteries, planted quietly during these very early seasons and left sitting untouched in the background for years, was the question of Cartman's father, a single loose thread mentioned briefly at the end of the first season, and then left hanging as the show moved forward into its next chapter. Section 3, The Search for a Father, Part 1. Among all of the running storylines that South Park built into Eric Cartman's life during its earliest years, few lasted as long or took as many strange turns as the question of who his father actually was. This mystery did not begin as a small aside buried inside another story. It became the entire subject of the very last episode of Season 1, and it stayed unresolved and hanging in the air for years afterward, long enough that by the time it was finally answered for good, an entire entirely different generation of viewers had started watching the show. The story began with the season 1 finale, an episode called Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut, which aired on February 25th, 1998. This episode became, at the time, the highest viewed episode in the show's history, watched by 6.4 million people during its original broadcast, a number that reflected just how quickly South Park had grown from a small cable curiosity into one of the most talked about shows on American television in less than a single year on the air. The plot centers entirely on Cartman realizing that he does not know who his father is, and setting out, with surprising determination for a young boy, to find out. The trigger for this search is a school event called Father and Son Day, something Cartman cannot take part in properly because he has no father at home to bring. He goes to his mother, Leanne, and asks her directly who his father might be. She tells him that she met the man in question at an event called the Drunken Barn Dance, held annually in South Park, but admits that the night is somewhat blurry to her, and that she does not remember for certain who it was. The episode was written by series co-creator Trey Parker, alongside staff writer David R. Goodman, and it was directed by Parker himself, following a production pattern that was fairly typical for the show's earliest seasons, when the writing staff remained small and Parker personally oversaw a large share of the scripts. The episode also featured a small celebrity cameo that many viewers might have missed entirely, since it did not involve any dialogue at all. Comedian and talk show host Jay Leno provided the sound effects for Cartman's pet cat, Mr. Kitty, contributing nothing more than a handful of cat noises to the finished episode. A low-key kind of celebrity appearance that fit the show's more modest, still developing production style during this early period, well before South Park became known for attracting larger, more prominent guest voices in later years. What follows is one of the more elaborate jokes the show pulled off in its first season. Cartman is told by his mother that a man known as Chief Running Water was likely his father, a Native American man who had been at the dance that night. When Cartman tracks him down, Chief Running Water tells him that this is not true, and that on that same night, Cartman's mother had actually been with the town's school chef, a character known simply as Chef. Cartman then goes to Chef, who denies being the father as well, and tells Cartman that his mother had actually preferred a different man that night, the school's teacher, Mr. Garrison. When Cartman finally corners Mr. Garrison admits that he may indeed have slept with Cartman's mother, but then adds that plenty of other men in town could say the exact same thing about that particular night, since it becomes clear that Leanne Cartman had been with a large number of men during the party, not just one. This chain of denials and admissions builds out a growing list of possible fathers, each one passing the responsibility along to someone else, which becomes the entire structure of the joke. Among the men eventually named or shown as possible candidates are Officer Barbrady, the town's chief of police, Jimbo Kern, Ned Gerblansky, Mr. Garrison, Gerald Broflovsky, who is Kyle's father, Dr. Alphonse Mephisto, a scientist character who appears often in early seasons, and even the entire 1989 Denver Broncos football team, which had reportedly been present at the Drunken Barn Dance as well. The scale of the joke, moving from one man to an entire professional football roster, gives a good sense of how far the show was willing to stretch a single premise once it had decided to commit to it. In a small detail that fans have pointed out over the years, the episode itself is slightly inconsistent about exactly which year of the Denver Broncos roster is being referenced, with Dr. Mephisto at one point calling them the 1989 Broncos, while the show's own narrator refers to them just moments later as the 1991 Broncos, a minor continuity slip that has never been corrected or explained in any official capacity. With the list of possible fathers growing too large to sort out through guesswork alone, the episode introduces a scientific solution. Dr. Mephisto offers to run a DNA test that could determine, once and for all, who among all these candidates was actually Cartman's father. The catch is that the test costs $3,000, an amount of money well beyond what a fourth grader could normally access. This sets up a subplot involving Stan, Kyle, and Kenny, who have secretly filmed Cartman having an imaginary tea party with his stuffed animals in his backyard, without his knowledge, planning to submit the footage to a television show called America's Stupidest Home Videos for a chance at a cash prize. This subplot also gives the audience one of the earliest glimpses of a softer, more private side of Cartman, showing him talking to stuffed characters like Clyde Frog and Rumper Tumpskin as though they were real companions capable of holding a conversation with him, a small but telling detail suggesting a lonelier inner life hiding underneath his usual loud, aggressive personality. Cartman is furious when he finds out about the tape, feeling humiliated by the idea of it airing on television, but he calms down once he understands that any prize money could go toward funding the DNA test he desperately wants. The video does not win the show's top prize, which instead goes to a separate submission showing showing Kenny being killed by a train, but it does earn a smaller runner-up prize of $3,000, which turns out to be exactly the amount needed to pay for Dr. Mephisto's test. The episode builds toward its climax at Dr. Mephisto's lab, where Cartman, his mother, and every single man who had been named as a possible father, including the entire Denver Broncos roster, are gathered together to hear the results. Just as Dr. Mephisto is about to announce the name of Cartman's real father, the show cuts away, with a narrator stepping in to tell the audience that the answer will be revealed in a new episode airing 4 weeks later. Cartman reacts to this cutoff with visible anger directed straight at the screen, a moment that doubled as the show poking fun at its own decision to leave viewers hanging over a month-long gap. This ending made Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut the first cliffhanger season finale in the show's history, a structural choice the series would only repeat one other time across its entire run, years later with a different mid-season finale. Critics reviewing the episode at the time generally responded well to it, with at least one television critic writing that the story worked as a surprisingly touching portrait of a child desperate for something solid to hold on to. Watching Cartman try on the identity and interests of each man he believes might be his father before that possibility gets taken away from him again. Years later, in a retrospective vote held among fans during the show's 15th anniversary period, Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut was voted the single best episode of the entire first season, a strong indication of how well the storyline had aged in the eyes of the audience long after its original broadcast. What happened next became almost as well known among fans as the storyline itself. Instead of resolving the cliffhanger right away when the second season premiered, Trey Parker and Matt Stone chose to air a completely unrelated episode as an April Fool's joke, a special built around two minor background characters named Terrence and Phillip, titled Terrence and Phillip in Not Without My Anus, timed to line up with April Fool's Day that year. Viewers expecting the payoff to the father mystery instead got an episode with no connection to Cartman's storyline at all. This decision led to real frustration among the show's audience at the time, with reports of more than 2,000 angry complaint emails sent to Comedy Central within a single week of that April Fool's broadcast. Some later reporting noted that certain fans continued to hold a grudge over the prank for years afterward, a sign of just how seriously people had come to care about getting an answer to the mystery the show itself had created. Parker and Stone have never framed this decision as a mistake or something they regretted, generally treating it in later interviews as exactly the kind of prank that fit naturally with the show's overall attitude toward its own audience, more interested in keeping people off balance than in giving them a comfortable, predictable viewing experience. The actual resolution finally arrived 3 weeks after that April Fool's episode, in a follow-up episode titled Cartman's Mom is Still a Dirty Slut, which premiered on April 22nd, 1998, as the second episode of Season 2 overall. This episode picks up directly from where the cliffhanger had left off, with Dr. Mephisto gathered together with Cartman, his mother, and all of the possible fathers once again, ready to finally deliver the results of the DNA test. Before he can say the name out loud, Dr. Mephisto is suddenly shot by an unseen attacker, sending the room into chaos. The four boys, along with Chef, rush Mephisto to the local hospital, called Hell's Pass Hospital, all while the entire town of South Park finds itself trapped under a massive, sudden blizzard that cuts off power and access to the outside world. Much of this second episode focuses on the chaos inside the hospital during the blizzard, including a scene where Kenny, after finding that a backup generator has no wire actually connecting its cords, decides to complete the electrical connection using his own body, an act that saves the hospital's power supply and the lives of the patients inside, including Dr. Mephisto himself, but instantly kills Kenny in the process. This kind of sacrifice, followed immediately by Kenny's death and the show moving on as though nothing unusual had happened, was already a familiar rhythm to viewers at this point in the series, reinforcing the running joke that had been building since the earliest episodes. A small additional detail from this same hospital sequence has stayed with fans over the years as well, a moment where Cartman describes Kenny's frozen body, left out in the cold for an extended period during the blizzard, using the phrase freezy pop, a small, oddly specific piece of dialogue that longtime viewers still quote from time to time when discussing this particular episode. Once Dr. Mephisto recovers enough to speak, he casually reveals that the person who shot him earlier was actually his own brother, who apparently makes an attempt on his life on a fairly regular basis, a detail treated as an unremarkable everyday fact rather than something worth dwelling on. With that resolved, Mephisto finally gathers everyone together again in the hospital to deliver the long-awaited answer to Cartman's question. The answer he gives gives is that Cartman's father is his own mother, Leanne. Mephisto explains that Leanne Cartman is a hermaphrodite, a person possessing both male and female biological traits, and that because hermaphrodites are unable to father children through another woman in the way a typical man would, the logical conclusion is that Leanne herself must have gotten another woman pregnant during her activities on the night of the drunken barn dance, and that this unnamed woman gave birth to Cartman. Rather than pursue the identity of this mystery mother any further, Cartman, visibly disturbed and overwhelmed by everything he has just heard, chooses to drop the subject entirely and walk away from the question rather than dig any deeper into it. This entire two-part storyline also says something specific about how the show's writers approached the character of Leanne Cartman from her very earliest appearances onward. According to background information about the show's production, Leanne's name and her heavily promiscuous personality were both drawn from a real person in Trey Parker's own life, a former fiancé whom Parker has said he once caught being unfaithful to him. Parker has continued using her name for various morally loose female characters across the show's history, and this two-part father storyline represents one of the earliest and most extensive uses of that basic character template, built entirely around a mother whose personal history is so tangled and so difficult to pin down that even a supposedly precise scientific DNA test cannot produce a clear, simple answer to a simple question. For years after this episode aired, this explanation stood as the accepted, official answer within the show itself. Cartman's father, according to the story the series had told its audience, was in fact his own mother. An answer strange enough to fit the general tone of South Park's humor during this period, while also successfully ending the joke that had stretched across 2 full episodes and a controversial month-long delay. This explanation held in place for over a decade of the show's run, referenced occasionally in later episodes but never seriously challenged, treated by the show's own internal history as settled fact. The episode itself went on to enjoy a strong reputation among fans in the years following its original broadcast, later voted by fans as the best episode of the show's second season during that same 15th anniversary retrospective vote that had already recognized its first part as the best of season 1, giving this single 2-part storyline the rare distinction of topping fan rankings for 2 entirely separate seasons of the show. It would eventually turn out many years later that this entire hermaphrodite explanation was not the real answer at all, but rather an elaborate cover story invented by the adults of South Park to hide a very different and far more complicated truth involving the Denver Broncos football team and one specific player who had been present that night. That full reveal did not come until season 14, arriving through a pair of episodes that would connect Cartman's father directly to one of the darkest and most talked about storylines in the show's entire history, a storyline that had not even happened yet at the time this earlier mystery was first being told. For now though, as far as season 2 era audiences knew, the case was closed, and Cartman was left to move forward through the rest of his childhood, believing that his own mother held the answer to a question that would eventually turn out to run much deeper than anyone watching in 1998 could have guessed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sitting quietly a few years further down the road, waiting for Cartman in the 5th season of the show, was a rivalry with an older boy that would end up reshaping how the entire series and its audience understood exactly what Cartman was capable of. Section 4. Scott Tenorman Must Die. By the time season 5 of South Park arrived in the summer of 2001, the show had already spent 3.5 years building Eric Cartman into a character known for lying, manipulating, and saying deeply offensive things without much concern for who he hurt. Even so, nothing in those first 4 seasons had prepared audiences for what was about to happen in an episode called Scott Tenorman Must Die, which aired on July 11th, 2001 as the 4th episode of the 5th season and the 69th episode of the series overall. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have both pointed to this episode many times over the years as a true turning point, not just for Cartman as a character, but for the entire direction the show was willing to take. The production history behind this episode gives some insight into just how much extra care Parker and Stone put into it compared to the show's usual weekly turnaround. Most South Park episodes at this point in the show's history were written, animated, and finished within a single week, often right up against the airing deadline. Writing on Scott Tenorman Must Die began in the middle of May 2001, more than a month before season 5 had even started airing, well ahead of the show's usual production schedule. This early start happened because the creators occasionally like to have one episode already partly finished, sometimes described as being kept in the bank, so that they could take a short break during the demanding 2-month stretch of producing a new season and still meet their deadline. storylines. In an early draft of the script, the episode carried a different title altogether, Scott Tenorall Must Die, before Parker eventually changed the character's surname to Tenorman, feeling that it worked better as a joke. By the time the season actually began airing, the episode had been pushed back from its original planned position as the season opener to instead air fourth, following 3 other episodes that had been finished more quickly. The story begins with something small and almost silly, the kind of setup that could easily belong in any earlier, lighter episode of the show. Cartman shows up excited in front of Stan, Kyle, and Kenny, bragging that he has reached puberty before any of them, since he claims to have grown his first pubic hair. He shows the boys a small, strange-looking clump of dark hair as proof. Stan and Kyle quickly explain that pubic hair is something a person's body grows on its own as they get older, not something that can simply be handed to someone else. This confuses Cartman, who admits that he actually purchased the hair for $10 from an older boy at the local high school named Scott Tenorman. Realizing he has been tricked and made to look foolish, Cartman becomes furious and sets out to get his money back from Scott. What follows is a back-and-forth battle of pranks and humiliations between Cartman and Scott, each one trying to outdo the other. Scott, an 8th or 9th grade student depending on which point in the episode is being referenced, proves to be far more clever than Cartman expects. Every attempt Cartman makes to recover his money or embarrass Scott in return backfires, often leaving Cartman more humiliated than before. In one attempt, Cartman tries posing as a tax collector to trick Scott into handing back the money, going so far as to introduce himself using the name of a real country singer, a small joke tucked into the episode that rewards anyone paying close attention to Cartman's fake identities. At one especially painful point in this escalating conflict, Scott forces Cartman to beg publicly for his money back while squealing like a pig, then records the entire humiliating scene and shows it to the whole town, adding insult to what was already a deeply embarrassing moment for Cartman. Rather than returning the money Cartman is owed, Scott burns it in front of him instead, making it clear that this was never really about the money at all, but about making Cartman suffer as much humiliation as possible. Cartman does not take this humiliation quietly. Furious at being outsmarted so completely, he writes a letter addressed to the band Radiohead, whom he knows Scott admires greatly, falsely claiming that Scott is suffering from a serious illness in an attempt to lure the band to South Park under false pretenses. This plan is part of a larger scheme Cartman builds around trying to convince the town, and eventually Radiohead themselves, to see Scott as pathetic and worthy of pity rather than respect, laying early groundwork for the humiliation Cartman ultimately intends to deliver at the story's climax. This repeated, escalating humiliation becomes the turning point that pushes Cartman toward planning something far more serious than a typical schoolyard prank. Cartman begins working on an elaborate revenge scheme, one that involves a pony belonging to a local farmer named Mr. Denkins. According to background details about the episode's writing process, Cartman's inspiration for this particular plan is drawn directly from the film Hannibal, referencing a scene in that movie involving a character who trains pigs to attack an enemy, reworked here into a pony aimed at Scott instead. Cartman's original plan, at least as far as Stan and Kyle understand it, involves training this pony to attack Scott in a very specific and painful way. Believing that Scott would never risk showing up to face this danger in person, Cartman assumes correctly that Scott will instead send his own parents to the farm to try to save or rescue the pony ahead of time, keeping himself out of harm's way. At one point in the episode, while trying to recruit other kids in town to help him in his plan against Scott, Cartman delivers a speech modeled closely on the rallying pre-battle speech given by Mel Gibson's character in the film Braveheart, another small but deliberate piece of movie inspiration folded into the episode's writing. At the same time, Scott has been building his own plan to further embarrass Cartman. Learning that Cartman had once tried to trick him using a video involving the band Radiohead, whom Scott greatly admires, Scott decides to arrange a public event of his own, a chili cook-off, where he intends to serve Cartman a bowl of chili secretly mixed with pubic hair collected from other kids around town, a cruel and humiliating callback to the earlier joke that had started their entire feud. Cartman, seemingly unaware of what Scott is planning, invites Scott to this same chili cook-off, dangling the promise of a free pony ride as bait to get him there. Stan and Kyle, who by this point are thoroughly disturbed by how far Cartman's revenge plan appears to be going, choose to warn Scott ahead of time that Cartman has trained Mr. Denkins' pony to attack him if he comes anywhere near it. This warning, which the boys give out of genuine concern for Scott's safety, turns out to be exactly what Cartman had been counting on all along. Knowing that Scott would take this warning seriously and stay away from the pony himself, but would likely still want the pony rescued from what he believes is an abusive situation, Cartman had anticipated that Scott would instead send his own parents to the farm that night to handle the supposed danger in his place. What actually happens at the farm that night is where the episode episode shifts from dark comedy into something far more disturbing. Mr. Denkins, who has been made unusually alert and suspicious by earlier warnings from Cartman about people trying to harm his pony, spots two figures trespassing on his property after dark. Believing them to be the people responsible for threatening his animal, Denkins shoots and kills them, only for the town to later discover that these two people were Scott's own parents, who had gone there in secret to try to protect the pony they believed was in danger. When confronted by the shocked townspeople afterward, Denkins defends his actions by pointing out that Scott's parents were trespassing on his land, and that he was simply protecting his own property and himself, a defense the town seems to accept without much further argument. In a small detail hidden in the background of an earlier scene of the Tenorman house, several South Park fathers, including Stan's father Randy and Kyle's father Gerald, can briefly be seen in disguise spying on Scott's mother, a quick freeze-frame moment unrelated to the main plot that has since become a piece of trivia longtime fans enjoy pointing out on repeat viewings. Cartman then reveals, in a moment that shows just how far ahead he had planned this entire sequence of events, that he had personally been present nearby when Denkins gave his official report of the shooting to the local police officer, Officer Barbrady. Rather than reporting what he had seen or expressing any concern about what had happened, Cartman instead took the opportunity to secretly steal the bodies of Scott's parents from the scene before anyone else could claim them. Over the course of that same night, Cartman used a hacksaw to cut apart and prepare the remains, spending hours working alone to finish what he needed done before the chili cook-off the following day. At the cook-off itself, Cartman presents Scott with a bowl of chili that Cartman claims he prepared specially for him. Scott, still operating under his own plan to humiliate Cartman with the pubic hair chili, ends up eating from Cartman's bowl while Cartman eats from the bowl Scott had prepared. Before Scott can reveal to Cartman the disgusting secret ingredient hidden inside his own chili, Cartman calmly reveals that he had already figured out Scott's plan in advance and had secretly swapped his bowl with a batch of chili prepared by Chef, the town's school cafeteria worker, meaning he never actually ate any of Scott's tainted chili at all. He even pauses briefly to compliment Chef directly on how delicious his chili turned out to be. A small, oddly polite touch dropped into the middle of an otherwise horrifying plan. Cartman then tells Scott that he already knew Stan and Kyle would warn him about the supposed danger from the pony, and that this warning had always been part of his larger plan rather than something that had gone wrong. Cartman then delivers the full truth to Scott directly. He explains, calmly and with visible pride in what he has accomplished, that he had arranged for Mr. Denkins to shoot Scott's parents, then had taken their bodies afterward, and had spent the night preparing them using a hacksaw so that he could serve them to Scott personally in the very bowl of chili sitting in front of him. Cartman names the dish out loud, calling it Mr. and Mrs. Tenorman chili, before asking Scott directly whether he had enjoyed the taste. As the full weight of what has happened settles over him, Scott searches through the bowl and discovers his mother's wedding ring, still attached to one of her fingers, sitting inside the chili he has just eaten. Overcome with horror, Scott begins to vomit and break down crying in front of the entire gathered town. At this exact moment, in one of the episode's most quietly brutal details, members of the real-life band Radiohead, who happen to be present in town at this point in the story, walk by and see Scott crying without knowing anything about what has actually happened to him. Believing him to simply be acting like a baby in public, the band members mock him for crying, deepening his humiliation even further at what is already the worst possible moment of his life. Rather than showing any hesitation or regret at what he has done, Cartman climbs up and begins singing a taunting song directly at Scott, celebrating what he has just accomplished. The episode then closes with one final disturbing image, as Cartman leans in and licks the tears directly from Scott's face, describing them out loud as yummy and sweet, and referring to them as the tears of unfathomable sadness. In a final touch that leans directly on classic cartoon tradition, the episode ends with an iris closing around Cartman as he delivers a signature Looney Tunes sign-off line, a deliberate and pointed choice by the writers, using the visual language of an innocent old-fashioned cartoon ending to close out a story that had gone so far beyond anything an old-fashioned cartoon would ever have shown. Watching all of this unfold, Stan and Kyle turn to each other, both of them visibly shaken by what Cartman has just done. Kyle tells Stan that it would probably be best for both of them to make absolutely certain they never anger Cartman to this degree again, and Stan agrees immediately, both boys clearly horrified by exactly how far Cartman had been willing to go over what had originally started as a simple $10 scam involving fake pubic hair. Kenny, notably, does not survive this particular episode either, dying earlier in the story after laughing himself to death over Scott's humiliating pig video video of Cartman, his ghost shown still laughing even after his body has gone still. A small but memorable variation on the show's usual running joke about his frequent deaths. Behind the scenes, Trey Parker and Matt Stone have spoken openly in later interviews and audio commentary tracks about how seriously they debated whether to actually go through with this storyline before the episode was finished. They have described discussing at length whether having Cartman orchestrate the deaths of two parents, then feed their remains to their own son was simply too extreme an act to give to a character who was still, technically, a 9-year-old boy on a television show. Parker has said that he ultimately felt the act needed to represent something close to the absolute limit of what Cartman could be shown doing, establishing a new and much darker ceiling for the character's behavior going forward. At the same time, the two creators made a deliberate choice to keep Cartman from directly pulling the trigger himself. The actual killing is carried out by Mr. Denkins, acting under his own mistaken belief that he was defending his property from trespassers, which allowed the writers to make Cartman responsible for engineering the entire outcome without having him commit the physical act of murder with his own hands. This episode also holds a notable place in the history of how South Park scripts were typically constructed. Parker and Stone have explained that Scott Tenorman Must Die was the first episode in the show's history built around a single continuous plotline, without any smaller side story running alongside it for contrast or pacing. Most earlier episodes had followed 2 or 3 separate storylines happening at once, but the writers found that the relationship between Cartman and Scott, which they have compared to the kind of relentless back-and-forth rivalry seen in classic cartoon pairings like Tom and Jerry or Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, was strong enough on its own to fill the entire episode without needing anything else running alongside it. The creators have said they were initially worried that removing the usual second storyline might leave the episode feeling thin or unfinished, but once the episode was complete, they realized that a single, tightly focused plot actually worked better than they had expected, a lesson that influenced how a considerable number of later South Park episodes were structured going forward. The impact of Scott Tenorman Must Die on how audiences and critics understood Cartman was immediate and lasting. The episode has been ranked repeatedly among the greatest episodes in the show's entire history by multiple outlets and fan polls over the years, including strong placements in reader and viewer voting conducted well over a decade after its original broadcast. Rolling Stone magazine listed the moment of Scott eating his own parents as one of the greatest moments in the show's history, describing the episode as a perfect blend of the show's ability to be shocking and genuinely well-crafted at the same time. A separate ranking from IGN singled out Cartman's line describing Scott's tears as yummy as one of the single best lines delivered anywhere across the entire series. Parker and Stone themselves have named the episode among their personal favorites on more than one occasion, including it in lists of their top episodes compiled in both 2003 and 2006. Fans have continued to rank it highly in the years since as well, voting it into second place during a major fan vote held in 2011, and again placing it in second position during a separate popularity tournament held roughly a decade later. At the same time, it fundamentally changed the baseline understanding of what kind of character Cartman actually was. Before this episode, Cartman could reasonably be described as a bratty, selfish, and often cruel child. After this episode, that description no longer felt complete. He had shown himself capable of long-term planning, patient manipulation of multiple people at once, and a complete willingness to end 2 adult lives and then celebrate that outcome directly to the face of the son left behind, all without showing a hint of guilt or hesitation at any point in the process. As something of a running echo of this episode, Cartman is shown across several subsequent episodes later that same season, occasionally threatening other characters by warning them that he will make them eat their own parents. A small but pointed reminder built directly into the show's ongoing dialogue of exactly how far he had proven himself willing to go. What makes this episode even more significant within the larger story of Cartman is something that neither the audience nor Cartman himself would learn until many years later. The identity of Scott's father, the man Cartman had arranged to be killed and had then personally prepared and served to his own son, would eventually turn out to matter far more than anyone watching in the summer of 2001 could have possibly known. That connection, buried quietly inside the show's own history for close to a decade before it was finally revealed, would end up tying this single dark episode directly back into the unresolved question of Cartman's own father, a mystery the show had first raised years earlier and had never actually settled with the true answer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sitting untouched in the background for the better part of a decade, the identity of Jack Tenorman waited to resurface, connecting back to a mystery about Cartman's own own father that the show had first raised years before this chili was ever served. Section 5. The Coon Rises. By the time South Park reached its 13th season in 2009, superhero movies have become one of the biggest trends in popular entertainment, with dark, serious takes on comic book characters like Batman dominating movie theaters and cultural conversation. Eric Cartman, always quick to notice a trend he could use for his own benefit, decided that South Park needed its own homegrown superhero, and that he was exactly the person to become one. This decision led directly to the episode simply titled The Coon, which aired on March 18th, 2009, as the second episode of season 13, and which introduced one of the most memorable extended storylines connected to Cartman in the show's later years. In this episode, Cartman creates a costumed alter ego for himself called the Coon, dressed in an outfit designed to resemble a raccoon, complete with a mask and a general look clearly inspired by the dark, brooding superhero films that were popular in theaters at the time. As the Coon, Cartman sets out at night with the stated goal of fighting crime and cleaning up South Park, positioning himself as a lone vigilante working outside the law in order to protect the town from wrongdoing. In practice, his crime-fighting efforts do not go especially well. At one point, he mistakes an ordinary man attempting to kiss his date goodnight for an attempted assault, a misunderstanding that leads to him being threatened with arrest by actual police officers rather than being thanked for his supposed heroism. Frustrated that nobody in town seems to be taking his new persona seriously, Cartman tries to build up interest in the Coon through word of mouth, telling classmates that the Coon will be making an appearance at a specific location, a Walgreens rooftop, later that evening. When Cartman shows up there in costume, expecting to finally be recognized as South Park's new protector, he instead finds another masked figure already waiting in the same spot. This second vigilante calls himself Mysterion, and unlike the Coon, he almost immediately begins receiving genuine attention and respect from both the police and the ordinary citizens of South Park, who are eager to know more about this mysterious new hero and openly ask the question that would end up defining much of the storyline going forward, which is simply who Mysterion actually is underneath the hood. The identity of Mysterion is deliberately left unanswered throughout this first episode, and Trey Parker has said in later comments that this was intentional, since he and Matt Stone did not have any single character specifically chosen to be Mysterion at the time they wrote this episode. The mystery around Mysterion's identity became one of the most frequently asked questions from fans about the show during this period, ranking alongside the long unanswered question of who Cartman's real father was as one of the two biggest ongoing mysteries the series had going at the time. According to information that later became public, an alternate ending for this first episode was actually filmed, showing a scene suggesting that Kyle might be the person underneath the Mysterion mask. But this ending was ultimately cut from the broadcast version because Parker and Stone felt it took up too much time for what amounted to a small joke, one that mainly existed to clarify that Kyle was, in fact, not who was hiding behind the mask. That deleted scene later became available separately as a bonus feature on the season's home video release. By the end of this first episode, with the villains introduced during the story, a character calling himself Professor Chaos and his assistant General Disarray having already been defeated, and with Mysterion having been unmasked in a moment that reveals only a portion of his face without fully confirming his identity, Cartman appears to convince himself that he is the true hero of South Park, someone the town genuinely needs. This sets the stage for what would become a much larger, more connected storyline the following year, when the show returned to this same cast of costumed characters and expanded their world considerably. That expansion arrived in the form of a 3-part continuation aired during season 14, made up of the episodes Coon 2, Hindsight, Mysterion Rises, and Coon vs. Coon and Friends. Together, these 3 episodes are often referred to collectively as the Coon Trilogy, and they represent one of the most ambitious multi-episode storylines the show had attempted up to that point, treating Cartman's superhero obsession as a genuine ongoing saga rather than a single standalone joke. In the first part of this trilogy, Coon 2 Hindsight, the storyline expands significantly beyond just Cartman and Mysterion. A new team forms, made up of several of the other kids from South Park, each one taking on their own costume superhero identity. Stan becomes Toolshed, a hero whose power involves control over power tools. Kyle becomes the human kite, capable of gliding through the air. Kenny continues on as Mysterion, whose true and most important power, revealed clearly throughout this trilogy, is that he cannot actually die in any permanent sense, always returning after being killed, though within his own perspective inside the story he experiences each death and reawakening fully, unlike the more casual, unexplained resets seen in the show's earlier seasons. Additional characters join this growing group as well, including a character named Mint Berry Crunch, whose powers are based based on the ridiculous premise of being half mint, half berry, and half crunch, played as an intentional parody of how overpowered and oddly specific many modern superhero characters had become in comic books and movies by this point. Cartman, still operating as the Coon, tries to insert himself as the natural leader of this new group, treating the entire arrangement as something closer to a business franchise that he personally owns and controls, rather than a genuine team of equals working together. This attitude quickly causes friction among the group, since the other members increasingly resent being treated as employees or subordinates rather than partners. Eventually, frustrated with Cartman's controlling and self-centered behavior, the rest of the team makes the decision to remove him from the group entirely, kicking him out for behaving, according to their own blunt description of the situation, like someone who was simply too difficult and unpleasant to keep around. Being cast out of the very group he had built does not sit well with Cartman, and rather than accepting the decision, he begins looking for a way to get back at his former teammates. This search for revenge becomes deeply tangled with a separate storyline running through this same set of episodes, involving a mythical entity from horror fiction called Cthulhu, who ends up being accidentally summoned into the story as a result of the real-world Deepwater Horizon oil spill disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, an event that had been dominating actual news coverage at the time these episodes were being written and produced. Cartman, seeing an opportunity in Cthulhu's sudden appearance, decides to align himself with this powerful, destructive creature, hoping to use it as a tool to get even with the former teammates who had rejected him. The second episode in the trilogy, Mysterion Rises, shifts more attention toward Kenny's role as Mysterion and the leadership responsibilities he takes on for the group once Cartman has been removed from it. With Cartman now working alone and increasingly allied with Cthulhu rather than with any of the other kids, the team under Mysterion's direction has to figure out how to respond to a Gulf area now under serious threat, all while continuing to deal with the fallout of Cartman's ongoing resentment and his willingness to align himself with genuinely dangerous forces simply to settle a personal grudge. The trilogy reaches its conclusion in the third episode, Coon vs. Coon and Friends, which aired on November 10th, 2010, and drew a strong viewership at the time, becoming one of the most watched scripted cable shows of that particular night, according to Nielsen ratings data from the period. In this final episode, Cartman, now working with Cthulhu fully under his command, manages to put the rest of the superhero team almost completely at his mercy, showing a level of cruelty and control that goes noticeably further than anything Cartman had displayed as the Coon back in the original 2009 episode that started this entire storyline. Kenny, meanwhile, continues to wrestle with the emotional weight of his ability to survive death repeatedly as Mysterion, a running thread throughout the trilogy that gives his character an unusually serious layer of depth compared to how his frequent deaths had typically been played earlier in the show's run, purely as a running joke. The episode eventually resolves with the full unmasking and reveal of every member of the superhero team's true identity, closing out the mystery that had been building since Mysterion's first appearance the year before. Reviews at the time of release were generally positive, with several outlets specifically praising how the trilogy managed to bring a genuine, satisfying conclusion to Kenny's immortality storyline, something that had never been explored with this much detail or emotional seriousness in the show's earlier years. Critics also noted, somewhat approvingly, that Cartman's arc across the trilogy showed him doing something the show does not always spell out clearly for its audience, which is genuinely believing, at least within his own mind, that his actions as the Coon were making South Park a better and safer place, even while every action he actually took throughout the story pushed further and further away from anything resembling real heroism. The Coon persona did not disappear from the show entirely after this 2010 trilogy came to a close. The character and concept returned again in later material, including an additional episode during season 21 that revisited the superhero idea once more, as well as a significant expanded presence in South Park-related video games released in the years that followed. In the game South Park: The Stick of Truth, Cartman leads one of two rival tribes competing over a fictional magical object called the Stick of Truth, and in its direct sequel, South Park: The Fractured But Whole, which is built entirely around a superhero theme inspired directly by this same Coon and Friends concepts from the television series, Cartman once again leads a team called Coon and Friends, expanding the roster even further with additional costumed characters drawn from across the wider cast of South Park kids. Looking at the full arc of the Coon across both the original 2009 episode and the 2010 trilogy that followed it, a fairly clear pattern emerges in how the show chose to use this storyline to reveal more about who Cartman really is underneath his usual scheming and manipulation. Unlike many of his other plans throughout the series, which are generally built around immediate selfish goals like winning a bet, getting revenge on a specific person, or simply getting something he wants in the moment, the Coon represents something slightly different, a sustained, long-running desire to be seen and treated as a genuine hero, someone people look up to and depend on. The tragedy of the storyline, played almost entirely for dark comedy rather than sincerity, is that every single method Cartman uses to try to achieve that goal, from mistreating his own teammates to eventually partnering with a destructive, ancient creature purely out of spite, moves him further away from anything resembling heroism rather than closer to it. This same pattern, wanting recognition and admiration while consistently sabotaging any real chance of earning it honestly, connects directly to something else that had been happening in Cartman's life around this exact same period of the show's history. At almost the very same time these Coon episodes were airing during season 14, the show was also finally preparing to answer one of its oldest and most anticipated mysteries, the true identity of Cartman's biological father, a question that had been sitting unresolved since that very first cliffhanger back in season 1, more than a decade earlier. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That long-buried answer, when it finally arrived just a few months before the Coon trilogy reached its own conclusion, would connect directly back to a name audiences already knew painfully well from one of the darkest episodes the show had ever produced. Section 6, 200 and 201, The Father Revealed. South Park reached a major milestone during its 14th season, hitting its 200th episode overall, and the show's creators decided to mark the occasion with a special two-part event made up of the episodes 200 and 201. These episodes, aired in April of 2010, were built around a large-scale celebration of the show's history, bringing back dozens of celebrities and public figures the series had mocked or referenced over more than a decade on the air. Tucked inside all of that spectacle was something fans had been waiting for since the very first season of the show, a final, real answer to the question of who Eric Cartman's biological father actually was. The episode 200 sets up the larger plot that both episodes share. A large group of celebrities who had previously been made fun of on the show, led by a character based on actor Tom Cruise, arrive in South Park together, having filed a class action lawsuit against the town. Their demand is that they be granted permanent immunity from ever being mocked or made fun of again. As the town scrambles to figure out how to respond to this threat, the story shifts toward a plan involving a group of religious figures the show calls the Super Best Friends, who are called upon to help find a solution to the growing celebrity crisis threatening South Park. Woven into this main plot is the return of a character from years earlier, Scott Tenorman, the same boy at the center of the disturbing chili incident from season 5. Scott had disappeared from the show entirely since that earlier episode, and 200 makes clear that in the years since Cartman fed him his own murdered parents, Scott has spent time in a mental institution, unable to move past what happened to him. During his time there, rather than simply trying to recover from the trauma, Scott had instead used the time to obsessively research Cartman's history, digging deep into old information about the town and its residents, driven by a clear desire for revenge against the boy who had destroyed his family years earlier. The episode 201 picks up directly where 200 leaves off, continuing the celebrity lawsuit storyline while also finally bringing Scott's return to its full payoff. Scott, now presented as a much more unstable and dangerous figure than the ordinary bullying teenager audiences had seen in season 5, has rebuilt an old group from the show's history called the Ginger Separatist Movement, a group Cartman himself had actually started years earlier, during an entirely different storyline mocking children with red hair. Scott repurposes this group as part of his plan to finally get his revenge on Cartman, using the movement's members to help him corner Cartman and force him to confront the truth Scott has spent years digging up. Scott reveals to Cartman that through all of his research during his time in the mental institution, he had uncovered something that the town of South Park had been hiding from Cartman his entire life. According to what Scott lays out, Cartman's real father was never actually his mother, despite what Cartman had been told back in season 2 during the earlier storyline where Dr. Mephisto claimed Leanne Cartman was a hermaphrodite capable of fathering her own child. That explanation, accepted by Cartman and by the show's own audience for well over a decade, turns out to have been a complete fabrication invented by the adults of South Park. The real story, as Scott explains it, goes back to the same night referenced all the way back in the very first season 1 finale, the drunken barn dance, where Cartman's mother had been involved with a large number of men, including the entire Denver Broncos football roster roster from that era. Among the players present that night was a man named Jack Tennerman, a right tackle for the Broncos. According to Scott's research, Jack Tennerman was the man who had gotten Leanne Cartman pregnant that night, making him Cartman's true biological father. This revelation carries an additional, deeply significant detail. Jack Tennerman was not simply some random football player who happened to be at the same party years earlier. He was Scott Tennerman's own father, the same man whose murder Cartman had personally arranged back in season 5, and whose remains Cartman had then prepared and fed to his own son in that infamous bowl of chili. This meant that Scott and Cartman had been half-brothers this entire time, sharing the same biological father, a connection that had existed quietly in the background for nearly a decade before either character or the audience watching at home had any idea it was true. The show also explains, through this same storyline, exactly why the town had gone to such extreme lengths to hide this information from Cartman for so many years. According to what is revealed in 201, the Denver Broncos had been having an especially strong season around the time Cartman was conceived, and the adults of South Park had made the decision that revealing a scandal involving one of the team's players fathering an illegitimate child with a local woman would create too much of a distraction for the team during that important stretch of games. Rather than risk damaging the Broncos' success that season, the town collectively agreed to bury the truth, going so far as to fabricate the entire hermaphrodite explanation and falsify the results of what Cartman had believed all those years earlier was a legitimate scientific DNA test performed by Dr. Mephisto. Learning all of this delivers a bitterly ironic gut punch to Cartman, one the show does not shy away from making explicit. For his entire life, Cartman had wanted nothing more than to know who his real father was, a desire that had driven the entire season 1 and 2 storyline in the first place. Now, finally learning the truth years later, Cartman discovers that he had already unknowingly orchestrated his own father's murder back in season 5, arranging to have him shot to death and then personally turning his body into the chili Cartman had used to torment Scott. The one thing Cartman had always wanted, a father, had existed, and Cartman himself had been directly responsible for taking that father away, years before he ever knew the connection even existed. The way South Park chooses to handle Cartman's emotional reaction to this revelation says a great deal about how the show continued to portray his psychology, even at this comparatively advanced stage in the series. As the town works to recover from the chaos of the ongoing celebrity crisis and Scott's revenge plot, Stan, Kyle, and Kenny find Cartman crying uncontrollably near an ambulance, clearly overwhelmed by everything he has just learned. Kyle, attempting to offer some comfort, tells Cartman that learning something this difficult about his own father must have been a genuinely hard thing to process. Cartman's response reveals exactly where his real distress is coming from, and it is not where the other boys assume. Rather than being upset about the fact that he indirectly caused his own father's death, Cartman explains that what is actually bothering him is the discovery that, because Jack Tennerman had red hair, Cartman himself now carries what he describes as a recessive ginger gene, a detail he finds far more devastating than the murder itself, given his own long history of mocking and looking down on redheaded children throughout the show's earlier seasons. This moment is followed by an additional layer of dark comedy involving a separate character Cartman occasionally uses throughout the series, a puppet persona operating from his own hand called Mitch Connor, who Cartman brings out during moments of stress or manipulation. In this scene, Mitch Connor tries to comfort a still distraught Cartman by pointing out that while he may indeed be part ginger now, he is also, as a direct result of the same parentage, part Denver Bronco as well, framing this connection to the football team as something Cartman should feel genuinely proud of rather than upset about. This reframing appears to work almost instantly, and Cartman's mood shifts from devastation to a kind of satisfied acceptance once he considers his newly discovered bloodline from this angle instead. The episode 201 closes out its main storyline elsewhere as well, resolving the celebrity lawsuit plot and dealing with the fate of Scott Tennerman, who ultimately escapes the events of the episode using a jetpack, vowing that he will return again in the future to continue his conflict with Cartman, a promise that has not been paid off with another direct appearance in the years since these two episodes originally aired. Both 200 and 201 also became notable for reasons entirely separate from the father storyline, largely due to controversy surrounding the episode's handling of the religious figure Muhammad, which led Comedy Central to censor significant portions of the broadcast and eventually resulted in both episodes being difficult to find on many official streaming platforms in the years since their original release, even as their core storyline about Cartman's parentage remained a fully canon, accepted part of the show's history going forward. had. Critics who reviewed 201 at the time it aired generally agreed that the father reveal represented one of the stronger elements of the two-part special, with several specifically praising how effectively it tied back to Scott Tenorman Must Die from nearly a decade earlier, treating that connection as a strong, well-earned payoff to a storyline that had technically been sitting dormant and unresolved since season 1. The episode drew a large audience during its original broadcast as well, with reported viewership making it the most watched program on cable television in the country on the night it aired. Looking at the full picture these two episodes create when placed alongside the earlier storylines they connect to, a clear thread becomes visible running all the way through Cartman's history up to this point in the series. The season 1 and 2 mystery about his father, the season 5 murder of Scott's parents, and the season 14 reveal tying those two storylines together were never actually separate, unrelated pieces of the show's history, even though roughly 9 years had passed in real broadcast time between when the first mystery was introduced and when its true answer was finally given. The show had been quietly building toward this exact connection long before most viewers, and possibly even before Parker and Stone themselves, had fully worked out every detail of how it would eventually come together. This reveal also marks a turning point in how deeply personal Cartman's ongoing string of consequences had become by this stage in the show's run. Earlier storylines involving Cartman's cruelty toward other people had generally shown consequences landing on the people he targeted rather than on Cartman himself. The Tenorman father reveal flips that pattern in a significant way, making Cartman himself the one left to carry the emotional weight of a truth he cannot undo or take back, even if his own reaction to that truth remains true to his character throughout the entire series, focused on the wrong detail entirely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Cartman's father may finally have been revealed, but the people closest to him in his day-to-day life, the ones who actually put up with him season after season despite everything, were about to become just as important to understanding who he really was underneath all of it. Section 7. Cartman and Butters. Among all the relationships Eric Cartman has had throughout the run of South Park, none is stranger or more consistent than his connection to Leopold Stotch, a classmate almost everyone in town, including the show itself, refers to simply as Butters. While Stan, Kyle, and Kenny make up the original core friend group Cartman has belonged to since the very first episode, Butters occupies a different kind of space in Cartman's life entirely, one built less on shared history and more on Butters' unusual willingness to keep coming back, no matter how badly Cartman treats him. Butters is introduced across the show's earlier seasons as a mild-mannered, endlessly polite, and somewhat naive classmate, someone raised by strict parents who frequently ground him for reasons that often seem minor or unfair. This combination of traits, gentle, eager to please, and desperate for approval, makes Butters an easy target for a boy like Cartman, who has shown throughout the series that he is quick to identify and exploit exactly this kind of personality in the people around him. Unlike Kyle, who fights back against Cartman constantly and refuses to simply accept what he says, Butters tends to go along with Cartman's instructions and stories far more easily, which is part of what makes him such a frequent target for Cartman's schemes across so many different seasons of the show. One of the clearest early examples of this dynamic comes from the season 4 episode Cartman joins NAMBLA. In this episode, Cartman decides he has grown tired of hanging around Stan, Kyle, and Kenny, believing himself too mature for their company, and instead begins looking for older, more sophisticated friends through internet chat rooms. This search leads him, without his full understanding of what he is actually doing, into contact with the organization known as NAMBLA, a real and widely condemned group associated with deeply inappropriate relationships involving young people. As part of the episode's storyline, Cartman convinces Butters to go along with a plan connected to this group, telling him it will help the two of them make new friends, without Butters having any real understanding of the danger involved. The episode plays this entire situation as extremely dark satire, using Cartman's total lack of awareness about what he has actually gotten involved in, and Butters' complete trust in whatever Cartman tells him to do, as the central engine of the story. It stands as one of the clearest illustrations from the show's history of exactly how far Cartman is willing to involve Butters in his schemes, without any real concern for whether it might put him in serious danger. A similar pattern shows up again in the season 5 episode Cartman Land, though in a considerably lighter and less disturbing way. In this episode, Cartman inherits a large sum sum of money from his grandmother and uses it to purchase an entire amusement park for his own personal exclusive use, refusing to let anyone else inside except for himself. Facing mounting costs to keep the park running, Cartman eventually needs to bring in paying customers to cover his expenses, and the show specifically establishes that Butters is the very first person Cartman allows through the gates once he opens the park to the public. This small detail, choosing Butters first among everyone in town, reflects something that recurs constantly throughout the show, a pattern in which Cartman, whether motivated by genuine fondness or simple convenience, keeps returning to Butters again and again whenever he needs someone reliable and unlikely to push back. The show also gives clear examples of Cartman actively working to keep Butters out of situations Cartman wants for himself, sometimes going to extreme and elaborate lengths to do so. In the season 7 episode Casa Bonita, Cartman becomes desperate to be invited to Kyle's birthday party, which is set to take place at a real Mexican-themed restaurant called Casa Bonita, a location the show treats as an object of near obsession for Cartman throughout the episode. Learning that Butters has been invited to the party in his place, Cartman comes up with a plan to trick Butters into believing that a meteor is about to strike the Earth, convincing him that hiding inside a bomb shelter for his own safety is the only responsible choice. Butters, trusting Cartman's warning completely, spends more than a week locked away underground, believing he is protecting himself from a genuine apocalypse, also that Cartman can take his spot at the restaurant instead. This episode is frequently cited as one of the clearest examples in the entire series of just how far Cartman is willing to go, and how completely Butters is willing to trust him, even when the outcome causes Butters real harm and real fear. Not every storyline between the two of them follows this same one-sided pattern of Cartman exploiting Butters' trust for his own gain. The season 8 episode Awesome-O flips the usual dynamic in an interesting direction. In this story, Cartman disguises himself as a robot, calling himself Awesome-O, specifically in order to get close to Butters and trick him into revealing embarrassing personal information that Cartman can later use against him. The plan works at first, but it eventually spirals out of Cartman's control when Butters, without realizing Cartman's true identity, records a certain embarrassing video and holds on to it. By the end of the episode, it is Butters who ends up holding real power over Cartman, using that footage to get some measure of payback against him. Episodes like this one show that despite how badly Cartman generally treats Butters, Butters is not always shown as a completely helpless target. On occasion, the show allows him to come out on top, even if only briefly, before Cartman inevitably finds some way to move the balance of power back in his own direction. Even during periods when the rest of the town turns against Cartman, Butters is frequently shown as one of the very few people willing to stand by him. This appears clearly in the season 9 episode The Death of Eric Cartman, in which the other kids at South Park Elementary collectively decide to ignore Cartman entirely, having grown fed up with his behavior to the point that they refuse to acknowledge his existence at all. Cartman, unable to understand why nobody will speak to him, eventually becomes convinced that he must have actually died without realizing it, and spends much of the episode trying to figure out how to move on from what he believes is his own death. Throughout this entire ordeal, Butters remains one of the only people still willing to interact with him normally, staying by his side even while the rest of their classmates have collectively frozen him out. The show also uses Butters as a way to reveal small, genuine moments of vulnerability in Cartman that rarely surface around any of the other characters. In the season 11 episode Le Petit Tourette, Cartman fakes having Tourette syndrome as a way of saying whatever offensive things he wants without facing any real consequences, believing the condition will excuse him from responsibility for his words. At one point during this episode, while confiding in Butters, Cartman accidentally reveals a deeply embarrassing personal detail about an experience involving a cousin, information he clearly did not mean to share, and Butters reacts with more open curiosity than judgment. Later in that same general period of the show, after Kyle unintentionally helps stop Cartman from publicly revealing an entire string of his darkest secrets on national television, Cartman actually hugs Kyle and tells him that he loves him, a rare and genuine seeming moment of gratitude that stands out precisely because it happens so infrequently across the entire series, and because Butters, present nearby, plays a quiet supporting role in how that moment comes together. As the show moved into its later seasons, the relationship between Cartman and Butters gradually took on a slightly different shape compared to how it had operated in earlier years. Where the earliest seasons largely used Butters as a tool for Cartman's schemes and little else, later seasons increasingly show the two of them simply existing together in quieter, more everyday moments, without a scheme necessarily driving the interaction at all. Episodes from the show's second and third decade on air show small scenes of the two of them playing together, Butters defending Cartman during arguments with the other boys, and Cartman occasionally offering Butters something that looks close to actual encouragement, such as praising his skill at a particular task or his usefulness on a team, phrased in Cartman's typically blunt and self-centered way, but recognizable as praise all the same. During the period of the show dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, small character beats continued to appear, showing Cartman confiding certain personal frustrations specifically to Butters rather than to the rest of the group, treating him as something closer to a genuine confidant during moments of stress. None of this later shift erases the far darker history between the two characters built up across the show's earlier seasons. Butters has been manipulated by Cartman into dangerous situations, locked away out of simple convenience, used as a source of information through deception, and repeatedly treated as less important than Cartman's own immediate wants. At the same time, across hundreds of episodes and more than 2 decades of the show's run, Butters remains one of the only characters in South Park who continues showing up for Cartman again and again, largely without holding permanent grudges the way Kyle or Stan often do after their own conflicts with him. Whether this pattern reflects something close to real affection on Cartman's part, buried underneath decades of manipulation and self-interest, or simply reflects how convenient and easy Butters has always been to use, the show itself never fully settles the question, choosing instead to let both possibilities sit side by side across the many episodes the two characters share together. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Butters was never the only person outside Cartman's original friend group to end up tangled in his personal life for years at a time, and one relationship still waiting further down the timeline would push Cartman into territory that Butters, for all his patience, never once occupied. Section 8. Cartman and Heidi Turner. Among every relationship Eric Cartman has been part of throughout the run of South Park, few carry as much detailed, documented history as the one he shared with a classmate named Heidi Turner. Unlike his long-running dynamic with Butters, which stretched across many years without ever being labeled a romantic relationship, Cartman and Heidi's connection became something the show treated as an actual boyfriend and girlfriend relationship, one that played out across multiple seasons with a level of continuity that few other storylines involving Cartman ever received. The roots of this relationship go back further than most viewers realize, connecting to a character first introduced under a different name years earlier. Heidi Turner had appeared in the background of South Park for a long time before becoming a major character, including an early appearance under the name Marcy, where she was shown as one of several children drawn into a church group that Cartman had organized. Small moments like this had scattered her presence throughout the show's history long before the writers ever built a dedicated storyline for her, treating her as one of many background classmates who occasionally received a line of dialogue or a small role in a specific episode. The turning point for Heidi's character arrived during season 19 in the season premiere titled Stunning and Brave. In this episode, Cartman is shown referring to Heidi using an insulting and demeaning nickname, an act that leads directly to him being suspended by a character called PC Principal, a new authority figure introduced that same season specifically to police offensive language and behavior around South Park Elementary. Cartman reacts to this punishment with visible frustration and disappointment, viewing the suspension as unfair rather than as a fair consequence for what he had said. This moment set an early tone for how Heidi and Cartman's relationship would eventually develop, establishing from the very beginning that their connection was tangled up with disrespect and conflict rather than anything resembling a normal friendship. The storyline advanced significantly during season 20, beginning with the episode Member Berries. During this stretch of episodes, an anonymous account calling itself Skank Hunt 42 began targeting several of the girls at South Park Elementary with cruel, sexually harassing messages sent through social media. Heidi Turner becomes the very first person to publicly accuse Cartman of being behind this account, a suspicion she continues to voice even as other classmates pile on with harassment and criticism directed at Cartman over the accusation. This continued pressure eventually pushes Heidi to quit using social media altogether, unable to handle the ongoing conflict surrounding the situation. Later in that same season, once Cartman is forcibly removed from all of his own social media accounts and it becomes clear that he was, in fact, not responsible for the Skank Hunt 42 messages, Heidi and Cartman find themselves spending time together, discovering that they share a similar sense of relief in no longer having to deal with the pressures of social media at all. Heidi eventually apologizes directly to Cartman for having accused him earlier, and the two of them begin building what looks, for a while, like a genuine friendship built on this shared experience. This growing friendship takes a notable turn later in season 20, when Cartman expresses confusion and curiosity about basic anatomy differences between boys and girls, and Heidi offers to help clear up his confusion directly. By the episode Wieners Out, out later that same season, this build-up culminates in Heidi showing Cartman what he had been curious about, done briefly and from a distance in a dark room. An event which the show treats as the moment the two of them officially become boyfriend and girlfriend. From this point forward, Heidi and Cartman are consistently shown together as an official couple throughout the remainder of season 20, holding hands regularly, referring to each other using affectionate nicknames like Boo and Babe, and generally presenting themselves publicly as a happy couple, despite the surprise and open disapproval expressed by many of their classmates, who struggle to understand how someone like Heidi ended up with someone like Cartman. During this stretch of the relationship, the show makes a point of showing Cartman speaking about Heidi in consistently positive terms, frequently describing her as really smart and really funny to anyone who will listen. At the same time, the show plants small but noticeable signs that this praise may not reflect genuine respect underneath the surface. Cartman is shown repeating these same compliments about Heidi so often and so mechanically that they start to feel more like a rehearsed line than a real reflection of what he actually believes about her, a detail that becomes more important as the relationship continues to develop into the following season. Season 21 opens with the episode White People Renovating Houses, and it is here that cracks in the relationship become fully visible for the first time. The two break up in this episode specifically because Cartman shows no real interest in listening to Heidi talk about her feelings, her day, or anything happening in her own life, treating conversations that require him to focus on her rather than himself as tedious and unwelcome. This breakup does not last, however, and the two of them get back together shortly afterward in a later episode called Put It Down, though the circumstances surrounding their reunion reveal something considerably darker about the dynamic between them. According to how this episode plays out, Cartman had actually threatened to take his own life as a way of pressuring Heidi back into the relationship, but rather than admitting this directly, he instead spins the situation to make it sound as though Heidi was the one who had made the suicide threat. The full truth only comes out when Heidi discloses an actual voicemail recording of Cartman making the threat himself, sharing this recording with Stan as proof of what had really happened. This pattern of manipulation continues to build across the following episodes of that same season. In an episode called Sons of Witches, Heidi is shown preparing for a planned pumpkin patch outing with Cartman, only for their date to be interrupted by an actual witch that has been causing trouble around town throughout the episode's storyline. Cartman convinces Heidi to dress up as characters from the story of Hansel and Gretel, and leads her out into the woods as part of a plan connected to dealing with the witch. When the witch actually appears, Cartman immediately abandons Heidi and flees the scene himself, leaving her behind to be captured and kidnapped by the witch entirely on her own, an act that shows Cartman prioritizing his own safety over Heidi's without a moment of hesitation, despite being her boyfriend at the time. The full collapse of the relationship arrives in the season 21 finale, an episode called Splatty Tomato. By this point in the season, Heidi has begun to recognize a pattern that had been building for a long time without her fully acknowledging it, coming to understand that she has been manipulated by Cartman throughout much of their relationship, and that she had also fallen into a pattern of treating herself as a victim in ways that were not always accurate or healthy, a habit she recognizes she picked up specifically after becoming involved with him. This realization leads directly to their final and permanent breakup, closing out a storyline that had run continuously across 2 full seasons of the show, longer and more consistently tracked than almost any other personal relationship Cartman had been part of up to that point in the series. Looking at the full arc of this relationship from beginning to end, a clear and consistent pattern emerges across nearly every episode involved. Heidi Turner enters the relationship as someone with her own independent personality, her own suspicions about Cartman, and her own willingness to stand up and publicly accuse him of wrongdoing when she believed he deserved it. By the end of the storyline, she has been shown threatened into staying in the relationship through a faked suicide crisis, abandoned in a moment of real danger without a second thought from the person supposedly protecting her, and left to recognize on her own that she had picked up habits of self-blame and self-doubt specifically as a result of the time she spent with Cartman. The show never explicitly narrates this pattern as abuse in blunt terms, choosing instead to let the individual episodes speak for themselves through the specific choices Cartman makes at each stage of the relationship. But the events shown across these episodes track a clear and consistent decline from friendship to partnership to something considerably more damaging for the person on the receiving end of it. The Heidi Turner storyline also stands out because of how directly it connects back to patterns already established in earlier seasons of the show, long before Heidi herself became a major character. Cartman's willingness to manipulate people close to him for his own benefit, first shown clearly through his treatment of Butters in earlier seasons, and his consistent unwillingness to accept blame for his own actions, a trait visible as far back as the show's earliest third-grade era episodes, both reappear throughout the Heidi storyline in a more serious, more consequential form. Where his manipulation of Butters had generally been played for a kind of dark comedy, often ending with Butters recovering quickly and returning to his usual cheerful demeanor within the same episode or shortly after, the toll taken on Heidi across 2 full seasons is treated with noticeably more weight, ending not with a joke or a quick reset, but with Heidi actively working to recognize and step away from a pattern that had clearly done her real, lasting harm. By the time this storyline reached its conclusion, South Park had spent more continuous episodes developing Cartman's romantic relationship with Heidi Turner than it had spent on almost any other personal relationship in his life outside of his own mother. The breakup in Splatty Tomato closed out this particular chapter for good, with the two characters returning to separate paths afterward. But the pattern the storyline had traced, charm giving way to control, and control eventually giving way to real harm, remained one of the clearest windows the show had ever offered into exactly how Cartman treats the people who let him get closest to them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Long before Heidi Turner ever entered the picture, and long after her storyline came to its close, one relationship in Cartman's life never changed shape at all, staying exactly as patient and exactly as forgiving as it had always been, sitting quietly in the background the entire time. Section 9. The Pandemic Years and Growing Up on Screen. When the real-world COVID-19 pandemic began spreading across the globe in early 2020, South Park responded the way it always had to major world events, by folding the crisis directly into the lives of its characters rather than avoiding it. This resulted in a series of special episodes rather than a traditional season, giving audiences a chance to see how Eric Cartman, along with the rest of the cast, would react to a genuine global disruption unfolding in real time. These specials also opened the door to something the show had rarely attempted before in any serious way, letting audiences briefly glimpse who these characters, including Cartman, might become once they were no longer children. The first of these specials, called the Pandemic Special, premiered on September 30th, 2020, as the opening episode of season 24. The special centers heavily on Randy Marsh, who spends much of the episode trying to hide his own accidental role in starting the pandemic, a secret tied to an earlier trip involving contact with a bat and a pangolin. While Randy's storyline dominates much of the plot, Cartman's role in this same special reveals a great deal about how his personality adapted, almost effortlessly, to a world suddenly built around isolation and lockdown. Cartman is shown to be genuinely thrilled about the arrival of social distancing, seeing remote learning as an opportunity rather than an inconvenience. He figures out how to fake internet connection problems during his Zoom classes, specifically so he can avoid attending school from home at all, treating the entire disruption as a personal victory rather than a crisis. When his mother later informs him that the school plans to reopen, Cartman reacts with genuine fury, upset at the idea of losing the freedom the pandemic had accidentally handed him. The special eventually escalates into a chaotic mix of subplots, including riots breaking out around town, the local police department taking over teaching responsibilities at South Park Elementary due to funding cuts, and a global effort to develop a vaccine using a pangolin that Randy has taken responsibility for protecting. Cartman becomes involved directly in this pangolin storyline near the end of the special, at one point attempting to kill the animal himself before backing down after Stan delivers an impassioned speech convincing him otherwise. This small moment stands out because it shows Cartman capable of being persuaded away from a violent impulse through appeal to something resembling empathy, even if the show frames the moment with its usual absurd chaotic energy rather than any real emotional weight. The story continued several months later with a second special called South Park Q Vaccination Special, which premiered on March 10th, 2021 as the second and final episode credited to season 24. This special shifts its focus toward the difficulties of getting vaccinated once a vaccine finally becomes available, while also spending considerable time exploring how months of pandemic isolation had put real strain on the friendship between Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny. Early in the episode, Cartman and Kenny are shown pulling a cruel prank on their teacher, Mrs. Nelson, involving a packet of ketchup meant to embarrass her in front of the class. The prank leads to Mrs. Nelson quitting her job entirely, and in the process reveals that she herself has not yet been vaccinated, setting up much of the special's driving plot around trying to secure vaccine doses for the school's teachers. Facing backlash for the prank, Cartman, Kenny, Stan, and Kyle attempt to make amends by working together to obtain vaccines for the school, forming a temporary group they call the Community Kids. Even while working toward toward this shared goal, the boys clash sharply over what to actually do with the vaccines once they get their hands on them. Cartman wants to sell the doses for profit rather than give them away, showing that even in a moment meant to demonstrate teamwork and responsibility, his first instinct remains focused on personal gain rather than the well-being of others. The episode also spends meaningful time on a conversation between the boys about how the pandemic had genuinely damaged their friendship as a group, with Cartman, Stan, and Kyle eventually agreeing to a plan to split time with Kenny going forward, treating their fractured friend group almost like separated parents working out a custody arrangement for a child. This small detail, treated with a surprising amount of sincerity for a South Park storyline, gave audiences a rare look at Cartman acknowledging that something real had been lost between the four of them during the isolation of the pandemic period, even if his solution to the problem remained as strange and self-centered as ever. A later special, released in November 2021, pushed this storyline even further by imagining what these characters might look like decades into the future. Titled South Park Post-COVID, this special jumps forward roughly 40 years, showing adult versions of Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny living in a world still dealing with the long-term consequences of the pandemic. Kenny, working as a scientist, has died while researching a cure for a mutated version of the virus, and his old friends are drawn back together to search for the data he left behind. This special gave the show a rare opportunity to depict what an adult Cartman might actually be like, portraying him, according to descriptions of the special's plot, as a bitter man living a difficult life on the streets, a stark and intentionally uncomfortable image compared to the confident, scheming boy audiences had followed for decades. Whether or not this future timeline was meant to be treated as permanent canon going forward, the special used it to explore, briefly and with the show's usual mix of absurdity and genuine feeling, exactly how much damage the broken friendships from the pandemic years might have caused if left unresolved for the rest of these characters' lives. Around this same general period, the show also began developing a separate, more grounded storyline focused specifically on money problems within Cartman's own household, one that unfolded gradually across season 25 and into some of the streaming specials that followed it. This arc introduced a meaningful shift for Cartman's mother, Leanne, who is shown pursuing a career in real estate, something presented as a genuine source of independence, purpose, and stability in her life, markedly different from how she had generally been portrayed across earlier decades of the show. For the first time in the series' history, Leanne appears to have something entirely her own, separate from her role as Cartman's endlessly patient and permissive parent. Cartman, however, quickly comes to resent his mother having something that pulls her attention away from him. Rather than supporting her success, he works to sabotage it, going so far as to found his own competing real estate business specifically designed to interfere with hers, producing exaggerated promotional videos for the properties he claims to be selling. This conflict eventually pushes Leanne to quit her real estate job altogether, giving in to her son's demands the same way she generally had throughout the entire series. The consequences of this decision turn out to be far more serious than in typical earlier storylines involving Cartman getting his way. Without Leanne's income from real estate, the two of them can no longer afford to keep their family home, forcing them to move out entirely. They end up relocating into a building shaped like a hot dog, home to a restaurant called Deacon Bow's Hot Dogs, a setting that becomes a running reference across the back half of season 25 and into the streaming specials that followed. This new living situation places Cartman, for what may be the first time in the show's history, among the poorest kids in his own class, a reversal of the social standing he had generally taken for granted throughout the series. Cartman reacts to this new reality with open frustration and anger, blaming everyone around him except himself for the situation, despite the fact that his own actions directly caused the loss of the family home in the first place. This financial hardship storyline continued to surface in the specials that followed, including one called The Streaming Wars, in which Cartman is shown still desperate to move out of the hot dog-shaped building, going to considerable and characteristically absurd lengths, involving borrowed money in an attempt to improve his social standing and escape the situation his own earlier sabotage had created. Taken together, these two major threads running through the pandemic era of the show, the global health crisis specials and the household financial hardship storyline that followed shortly after, reveal something that had rarely been given this much sustained attention across Cartman's entire history on the show up to that point. Earlier eras of South Park had generally shown consequences for Cartman's actions landing quickly, and then resolving by the end of a single episode, with the show resetting back to its usual status quo shortly afterward. This later period allowed certain consequences to linger considerably longer, with the loss of the family home stretching spreading across multiple episodes and specials, rather than being fixed and forgotten within a single half hour. Whether this reflected a genuine shift in how the show's creators wanted to handle long-term consequences for Cartman specifically, or simply reflected the broader move toward longer, more serialized storytelling that came with the transition into the streaming special format, the effect was the same. For the first time in years, audiences were shown a version of Cartman living with the real, ongoing weight of a mistake he had personally caused, rather than one wiped clean and reset by the time the credits rolled. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. As South Park moved further into this newer era of extended specials and streaming distribution, the show began finding fresh, current material to build Cartman's story around. Material drawn directly from headlines still unfolding in the real world as each new episode went into production. Section 10. Cartman Today. By 2025, more than 27 years after his first appearance on television, Eric Cartman remained a central figure in South Park, still voiced by Trey Parker, still living in the same fictional Colorado town, and still finding new ways to insert himself into whatever major events happen to be dominating the news at any given moment. Season 27 of the show arrived that year, carrying significant changes behind the scenes as well as in front of the camera. Changes that reflected just how much the media landscape around South Park had shifted since Cartman first appeared in 1997. On July 21st, 2025, just 2 days before the season premiere, Trey Parker and Matt Stone announced a new deal with Paramount, agreeing to a 5-year arrangement covering streaming rights on Paramount Plus, with a commitment to producing 10 new episodes each year going forward. This deal, later reported to be worth $1.5 billion, also included plans for 50 new episodes to be produced through the year 2030, along with an agreement making the entire back catalog of the series available exclusively on Paramount Plus worldwide. This announcement came after the season had already faced one delay, having originally been scheduled to premiere on July 9th, 2025, before being pushed back 2 weeks to July 23rd. Parker and Stone had also stated the previous year, in September of 2024, that they intended to skip covering the 2024 United States presidential election directly, choosing instead to wait until the following year before returning with new material. Despite this stated intention to avoid direct election coverage, Season 27 ended up built almost entirely around a storyline involving a caricature of President Donald Trump, who appeared as a major character throughout every single episode of the season. This storyline included Trump shown in an ongoing, strange relationship with a character representing Satan, alongside satire aimed at his second presidential administration more broadly. The season premiere, an episode called Sermon on the Mount, set this tone immediately by weaving together storylines involving a religious figure, a version of Trump, and a lawsuit and settlement plot, all delivered with the kind of immediate, ripped from the headlines timing the show has always been known for. Cartman's own storyline within this premiere episode carried a notably dark thread of its own. Convinced that a cultural shift he describes as woke culture ending would somehow ruin his entire way of life, Cartman becomes distressed enough that he considers ending his own life over the fear, and in a moment that reflects his long-running pattern of pulling other people into his personal crises, he asks Butters to join him. This kind of storyline, treated by the show with its usual mix of dark exaggeration and social commentary, fits into a much longer pattern the series has used throughout its history, taking a real cultural conversation happening at the time and running it directly through Cartman's specific brand of self-centered panic. As the season progressed, Cartman found himself at the center of one of the season's most talked about and most controversial storylines, arriving in the second episode titled Got a Nut, which aired on August 6th, 2025. In this episode, Cartman transforms into a right-wing podcaster, a character widely noted by entertainment press and viewers at the time as closely resembling the real conservative commentator and activist Charlie Kirk. The same episode also included a parody of United States Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem. Reactions to the episode were sharply divided along political lines even before any real-world tragedy became connected to it. Noem herself publicly criticized how she had been portrayed, while Kirk, by contrast, responded to being satirized on the show with open enthusiasm, reportedly calling the portrayal a badge of honor and using a still image of Cartman styled to resemble him as his own profile picture on the social media platform X. This storyline took on a far more serious and somber dimension after Charlie Kirk was shot and killed on September 10th, 2025 during an event at Utah Valley University. Following his death, Paramount, the parent company of Comedy Central, made the decision to pull Got a nut from its scheduled rerun airing on the network the following day, though the episode remained available for viewers on the Paramount Plus streaming platform. This decision drew mixed reactions publicly, with some commentators specifically noting that Kirk himself had embraced and enjoyed the original episode before his death, arguing that removing it afterward may not have reflected his own actual feelings about how the show had portrayed him. The disruption caused by Kirk's death also affected the season's production schedule directly. South Park had been airing new episodes every 2 weeks throughout season 27, but on September 17th, 2025, Parker and Stone announced that the next scheduled episode would not be ready in time, pushing its release back one additional week to September 24th. In their public statement addressing the delay, the two creators took direct responsibility for missing the deadline themselves, making clear that no outside pressure or censorship played any role in the postponement, simply stating that they had run out of time to finish the episode properly. The rescheduled episode, once it aired on September 24th, was titled Conflict of Interest, and it returned to a lighter storyline focused on Cartman and Kyle clashing over a prediction markets app that had become popular among the students at their school, running alongside the season's continuing political storyline involving Trump. The remainder of season 27 continued on its every other week schedule, with new episodes airing on October 15th, October 29th, November 12th, November 26th, and a season finale on December 10th, 2025. One notable episode from this later stretch of the season, called Twisted Christian, aired on October 15th following a 3-week gap in new material. This episode placed Cartman directly at the center of the season's ongoing storyline involving the Antichrist, a plotline connected to Trump's fictional relationship with Satan that had been building across the season. According to press materials released ahead of the episode, Cartman becomes possessed during the story and turns out to hold the key to stopping the Antichrist from fully coming into being. The episode also tied into a real internet trend from that period involving the numbers 6 and 7, showing Cartman, Butters, and other South Park Elementary students swept up enthusiastically in the trend, treated by the school staff as something bordering on a strange, cult-like obsession among the student body. Season 28 of the show followed close behind, beginning production and airing on a schedule that continued directly out of season 27's ongoing storylines, rather than starting fresh. A structural choice that reflected how much more serialized and continuous South Park storytelling had become by this point in its history, compared to the mostly standalone episode format the show had relied on during its earliest years. Reports from around this same period described season 28 opening with material referencing the same viral 6-7 trend that had appeared in Twisted Christian, along with continuing storylines involving other characters introduced during the Trump and Antichrist arc from the previous season. Looking at where Cartman stands within the show as of this most recent material, the character remains in many important ways remarkably consistent with the boy first introduced back in 1997. He continues to insert himself into whatever major cultural or political conversation is happening in the real world at the time each episode is produced, whether that conversation involves a global pandemic, a viral internet trend, or an actual sitting president. He continues to manipulate the people closest to him, whether that person is Butters, his own mother, or an entire town of trusting adults. And he continues to escape any lasting consequences for his actions, with a persistence that has held steady across more than 400 episodes and nearly 3 decades of the show's run. At the same time, the version of Cartman appearing in these most recent seasons carries the full weight of everything the show has built into him across nearly 30 years of continuous storytelling. The boy audiences first met asking who his father was in 1998 eventually turned out to have already answered that question himself, years before he even knew what he was doing, when he killed and served his own biological father to an unsuspecting son in the summer of 2001. The friendships established in a 3rd grade classroom in the show's earliest episodes have stretched across decades of betrayals, reconciliations, romantic relationships, financial collapses, global pandemics, and now, most recently, a storyline involving the literal Antichrist, all while somehow remaining recognizably the same core group of characters riding the same bus stop in the same small mountain town. From 2 rough animated shorts made by film students with almost no budget in the early 1990s, through a television debut that shocked and delighted audiences in 1997, through a chilly dinner that redefined exactly how evil the character could be, through a father reveal nearly a decade in the making, through friendships and romantic relationships that revealed both surprising loyalty and genuine harm, through a global pandemic that forced the show to imagine what these characters might become as adults, and finally into a modern era defined by streaming deals, viral trends, and a storyline involving the end of the world itself, Eric Cartman has remained one of the most consistently present characters in the history of American television. The story that began with a nameless chubby boy drawn in construction paper has, across nearly 3 decades, grown into one of the most complete and most carefully tracked character histories in modern animation, still being written one new episode at a time as of the most recent material available today. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.